So there's been some good news today, which is that the Bell Hotel in Epping will be closed in 14 days' time. This is after the people there repeatedly protested to try and get the hotel closed, and eventually the council has given in and decided that they have to close the hotel because of it will just be too expensive to maintain and to police these protests. Now, the way that these hotels do get closed is by having repeated protests. And what these repeated protests do is there's a belief that these protests could be violent. Now, I don't think that they should be violent, but people in the council, in the police, people that work in the hotel will worry that the protests could be violent. And so they'll deploy police to ensure that order remains at the protest. And the deployment of this police will cost the council money. And if there's repeated protests, then eventually it's going to cost the council so much money to keep on policing the protests that eventually they'll give in and decide to close the hotel. This is even better if there's counter protests. You know, at some of the Epping protests, there were people from Stand Up to Racism counter protesting, and because there's a risk of violence breaking out between the two sides, the council has to deploy police, which increases the police budget, which means that they will look at closing the hotel. So if there is a migrant hotel in your local area and you're quite well known in the local area, then you can follow the lead of Epping and start a protest to get the hotel closed. And what it really shows is that if enough people make a stand, they can solve local problems. Now, just closing this hotel isn't going to solve everything, because unfortunately these migrants in the hotel, they're not going to be deported. They're just going to be moved to another part of the country. But what we need is for protests to happen wherever these migrants end up, and ideally the protests will happen before the migrants arrive, which is exactly what happened in London in the Britannica Hotel in Canary Wharf. It was revealed that the migrants from Epping were probably going to be relocated to Canary Wharf, and the local people there started protesting immediately, which is great because, you know, the Epping protests all started because of an alleged sexual assault, but ultimately protesting after a sexual assault doesn't undo the sexual assault. You have to protest before the sexual assault actually happens for, you know, anything bad to be prevented from happening. Unfortunately, the protests in London have not been strong enough to force the council to close the hotel, but it's still a start, right? If we imagine if there were protests happening all over the country, imagine where we would be. You know, think of it like this. You know, trying to shut down these migrant hotels can feel like playing whack-a-mole sometimes, but you know, if you had an infinite number of hands with an infinite number of hammers, you would be able to defeat whack-a-mole. And that's what we want. We want people rising up and protesting peacefully wherever there are migrant hotels, to send a message to the government that, you know, people have had enough. Now, what sort of protests do we not want? I think a good example of a bad kind of protest is the Tommy Robinson protest on September 13th. Now look, I'm sure a lot of good people are going to go there, and they're going to go there because they think that it will do something, but the truth is that it won't. One of the reasons for it is that protests, I think, should represent a cause rather than a person. You know, the protests in Epping were about getting the Epping Hotel shut down. When the English Defence League was around, the protests were about the grooming gangs, and it was also about advancing the English Defence League and making the EDL more well known amongst the public. And even though I don't really like the EDL because they're civic nationalist and so on, you know, they did become a successful organisation. But with these Tommy Robinson protests, all you're doing is just making Tommy Robinson more famous. But once people find out about Tommy Robinson, what are they actually meant to do? What sort of activism are they meant to get up to? You know, I'm not sure if he can answer that question. And, you know, this wouldn't be as big of a problem if Tommy Robinson was a decent guy, ethno-nationalist, but he's a fake civic nationalist, and, you know, people are still wasting time on him because they think that he's the man to save this country, when he really isn't. He's just containment against what we really need to save this country. Now, one of the concerns that I have with these protests against illegal immigration is that it could distract us from the real problem. And the real problem is legal immigration. If you look at the statistics, you know, like 95% of immigrants come here legally. You know, it's not illegal immigrants that are going to result in the British people becoming a minority in their own country. It's legal immigrants, and whether or not they come here on a visa or not, it's still a crime against this nation for the indigenous people to become a minority in their own country. I mean, even the UN says that it's against the Indigenous Rights Charter to force an indigenous population to integrate. And, you know, that's what we've got. I mean, even David Lammy says that the problem in this country is that the far right isn't integrating. It's not that immigrants don't integrate, it's that the far right don't integrate. But the far right are just the native people of this country, and people that are aware that they're native. And, you know, David Lammy is saying that they should integrate, which is a violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But of course, the United Nations only cares about Indigenous rights when it's non-white people that are Indigenous. So we just have to keep in mind that the real problem is legal immigration. That's what's resulting in us becoming a minority. And if Reform UK get in 2029, they won't solve legal immigration, but I'm hoping that they can solve illegal immigration, because that will shift the public discourse onto legal immigration. You know, there was an opinion poll which showed that people think that there are more illegal immigrants than legal immigrants, which is a problem, because whilst everyone agrees with deporting illegal immigrants, we need people to start supporting deporting legal immigrants. And hopefully, if Reform get in 2029 and stop the boats, people will start thinking about legal immigration and how that can be reversed. And if Reform don't stop the boats, then, I mean, crazy things are going to happen. I mean, people are not going to be ready for what's going to happen if Reform UK win in 2029 and they don't stop the boats. But yeah, now if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, follow me on X at Liam__GB, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.